Excellent. Well, thank you, Jakub, and the organizers here who invited me. I'm really excited to be here. And to get started today, that's my first time in Poznan, but not my first time in Poland. I live in Berlin. So to get started today, we're going to talk about a bit of a hot topic in my field, which is machine learning and natural language processing. And we're going to talk about identifying hate, abuse, and misinformation online. Can we do it? How can we do it? So on and so forth. And to begin, I want to begin with this image, which, how many people here have seen this image before? Yeah, it made the rounds a few years ago. It was published, a news magazine, so to speak. I guess it's a very political news magazine, one could say. And it was published shortly after the attacks in Cologne, or the sexual assault attacks in Cologne that were reported in the media in Germany, in Europe, and worldwide. And I wanted to take a look at this image because, for me, this image has a lot of meaning. And it has a lot of emotion behind it. In fact, when I first saw it, I thought to myself, is this satire? Is this art? Is this a weird fashion shoot I've never seen before? Because for me, it had so much symbolism and other things happening in it. So let's break it down quickly together. One of the things we're going to talk about today is media literacy, which is the ability to look at an image as almost an art critic would, and to try and break down how does it make us feel, what is it trying to tell us. So if my translation is correct, it says Islamic rape of Europe. Right, so we have the title, let's say, of the image, right, if it was an art piece. And then we have this image, this light-skinned woman fighting, wearing the flag of Europe, and she has these brown, presumably male hands that are grabbing her, presumably Islamic hands, right? And here we are with the message. And what is it trying to make us feel? Fear, maybe, xenophobia, hatred, possibly. Now I have another image that was also in the Polish news media. And how many people recognize this image or this protest? How many people heard about this? Yeah. This was Natalia LL. She is an artist. She has had her art displayed in Warsaw for some time. And the artwork shows a woman suggestively eating a banana and having a lot of enjoyment eating a banana. And they said, okay, this is obscene, it needs to be taken down, and people took to the streets to protest with bananas in hand. And they greatly enjoyed eating the bananas in all sorts of places across Poland. And what does this image tell us about sexuality? What does it tell us about women and empowerment? What does it tell us about femininity? Right, so here we have two very distinct images from two very different political news media in Poland. And I bring these up because I think that we need to have a serious conversation about propaganda and the birth of propaganda. Now, I don't know how many people here have seen the BBC documentary Century of the Self, but I can highly, highly recommend it. And it's a documentary that goes through kind of the history of advertising and or propaganda within our lifetime. Now, Edward Bernays, he was a relative of Freud, and he went into advertising. He was kind of like a Mad Men OG New York style advertisement. And one of his ideas was, we need women to smoke cigarettes, but women are, it's seen as unladylike, so how can we get women to smoke cigarettes? And his idea was based off of Freudian theory, of course. And what he said was the cigarette can be like a penis. And every woman wants a penis. So we will make the cigarette like a penis, and then every woman can have a penis and walk around with smoking a penis, I guess. Anyways, and so Bernays staged this protest where he had some women of society and some suffragists who went into the street with their cigarettes, aka small penises, and they marched and were defiant. Maybe he should have tried bananas. Actually, he did try bananas. So after the cigarettes were a great success, he was hired by Chiquita Banana, or otherwise known as the United Fruit Company. Now, the United Fruit Company during this era was trying to make US Americans interested in bananas. They had a bunch of bananas, they had a bunch of different farms in different places in Central and South America, and bananas were not very common in the US then, so they hired Bernays. What can we do to make bananas seem more American? And they had a bunch of recipes and women with bananas, perhaps less sexual than the other protests, but still women with bananas. And this continued until the United Fruit Company had a little bit of a problem. You see, there was a democratically elected president in Guatemala who said, you know what, we want to take back some of this land, and you're going to give it to us, or you're going to at least let us buy it back at a reasonable price, and so forth. Enter propaganda. So Bernays, by this point in time, was fairly good at propaganda because he was using this mixture of psychology and advertising. And although that this comic book is not directly attributable to him, he provided many pieces of this type of what we would call Red Scare propaganda, which was quite common, of course, during this era in the US and the Cold War and so forth. And this was to influence US society that we should help fight communism in the Western Hemisphere because it was going to invade our country and burn it all down. It was interesting when I was looking for some Red Scare propaganda, I wanted to find something that reminded me of that initial image of the woman in the European flag, and I did not disappoint myself. Here we have the US flag on fire. Of course, that's very bad in US society, right? And then we have these different presumed communists from Central and South America. They're darker skinned with darker hair, and that one of them is attacking a woman and the others are attacking men and so forth. And this type of propaganda that Bernays helped put together actually led to the CIA assisting in a coup of this democratically elected president who is actually not even a communist. He came up from the army. He did have leftist tendencies, but he wasn't a self-defined communist. And so here we see how propaganda, or psychology plus marketing, can play a large role in the way or the influence of politics, and it has been happening obviously for decades. Now, the Century of the Self documentary continues, and it goes into research done by the Stanford Research Institute on something called vowels, and this is fast forward to the 80s. What happened with vowels is that it wasn't working anymore, the same advertising techniques that they had done before. What happened in the 80s for the US is there was a shift towards the individualism. And so there was this idea that I'm unique and I'm not gonna go into your mass media market. I need something special to make me feel like buying your things. So Stanford was on the case and trying to research this, and they came up with the idea, and the research to back it, that psychological traits are more stable than societal trends and shared values and beliefs to explain and predict consumer behavior. And so they were able to show quite early, right, in the 80s now, that targeting people psychologically was better than targeting people even by their demographics or by their work or other things like this. That if you could psychologically profile them, you could sell to them quite well. This research continues to this day. And as part of this, I got inspired to perhaps dive deeper into this topic based on an argument I recently had with a Stanford professor. And the Stanford professor I was talking with had a very strong boundary line between what is considered safe propaganda, which is marketing, and what is considered unsafe propaganda, which is political influence, misinformation, these types of things, disinformation studies. But my question for us that I'll be coming back to for a few times throughout this presentation is there such a thing as good propaganda? Can we create propaganda for good without also having it be used for evil? And are there safe ways to psychologically target people? So, I don't have an answer, but these are important questions for us to ask. In order to kind of lay the groundwork to answer these questions, we should first look into the idea of if there is some way to actually identify this type of bad propaganda, right? Because if we could just identify the bad propaganda and remove it, then it's fine. Then all propaganda would be good, right? So let's take a look at the fake news problem and machine learning. So again, my background is in machine learning, natural language processing, and when the fake news data set started coming out, which was in 2017, I said, yeah, let me give it a try. I'm gonna train a few models and I'm gonna see what I come up with. These are some aggregates from several different models. This should not be taken as the best data set or even the best approach, but unfortunately, my small research also ends up supporting or is supported by much more in-depth and further research that has happened since 2017. And here on the, I don't know where the pointer is, but on the left here we have the labels for fake news, the top labels, and on the right we have the top for real news. And this is based off of several models I trained using just some classical machine learning approaches. And what we can see here is that we don't have a strong signal of fake news, and this is, again, by further research is shown. And for real news, we have essentially markers that a journalist has written this. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at context and determine this was written by a professional journalist. And for this reason, it says said, says, president. It uses kind of more formal or more journalistic language. Further research on this has proved, yes, stylistic cues, like whether a journalist wrote it or whether somebody who's a professional writer wrote it, is a good indicator. But if we just wanted to detect whether a professional writer wrote it or whether a journalist wrote it, there's probably a lot easier ways that we can look at this. For example, we could parse the URL. Seems pretty obvious, but it would work, right? So this is maybe a continued area of research, but unfortunately what we can't predict is what is going to show up in fake news. We cannot predict that very well. So, moving on. If we can't predict or determine fake news just by looking at the text of it, maybe we can figure it out another way. So one of the large pieces of the field of natural language processing is the ability to do information extraction. What we do with information extraction is we take articles from the web or from a particular source. We then parse information or facts from it. We do some validation and resolution to find any conflicts, perhaps, and resolve them before we have what is called a knowledge base. This is done commonly with sources like Wikipedia, but has also been done with textbooks and other things like this. Then the idea is that now we have this knowledge base and it has all of the truth of the world in it, right? Right. Anyways, so then we have new incoming sources, we perform the same information extraction, and we compare them to our knowledge base and say, oh, okay, is it true or is it false based on what I know about the world from the knowledge base? It should work, right? But what happens with breaking news? Or what happens when a state of society changes, right, and the knowledge base is no longer valid or needs to be updated? How do we keep this updated and valid in real time, let alone how do we actually represent all truth in the world in some sort of knowledge base form, right? And the other problem with this is that it's very difficult to find a knowledge base that will accurately predict whether something is mainly true or mainly false. And this is a good example of this is the war in Iraq in the United States, which I have done some research on way back in the day. And there was a lot of reporters who believed an internal source that said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. This was reported across many, many news outlets. It was treated as fact, and we now know that it was false and that it was released knowledge with a good state actor intention, right? With intentions that we would go to war. Right, and so there, our knowledge base would say, yes, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and we would allow fake news and or conspiracy and or propaganda to propagate, right? So this is a difficult problem to solve even just from an information extraction, getting it right, but it's also incredibly difficult in terms of how do we know what is mainly true and what is mainly false. So moving on, there has to be another way to solve this, right? Let's talk about graph theory. So graph analysis has been proposed time and time again as a way that we can determine validity on the internet. And the image that we have here to the left is put together by a professor of law who studied different types of law and politics, I believe, and he studied different types of relationships amongst the news outlets and the right-wing propaganda, so to speak, or news, alternative facts news in the US leading up to the 2016 election. Now I want to put a big asterisk on that image in that, of course, it is not a complete mapping of all sources, and this was hand assembled by a person, right? So I don't exactly know all of the entire process that the person went through, and it may or may not have human biases in it. However, it does kind of relate back to trust rank. I don't know if anybody remembers or if anybody works in search, they might already be familiar with trust rank. Anyone? No? Yes, okay. Trust rank was proposed in 2004 by Yahoo and said that we can determine trust of links on the internet by seeding it or finding good seeds and finding bad seeds, and then using the relationships within the graph to determine whether something is credible or not credible based on who is linking to it and who links in and out and so forth. And if you take a look at these nodes on the edges that you find, you see a whole bunch of sources that are all either linking to one source where none of the middle is linking to it, or very little of the middle is linking toward it, and they're all linking to each other. So essentially, these are malicious nodes, we could say. And in the same way that we countered spam or bad links in terms of SEO from the good old days of the early thousands and the invention of spam bots, then we could hopefully do the same for fake news. But the problem with this, unfortunately, there's a problem, is the concept of data voids. So I don't know if anybody here has heard of data voids yet. Okay, so Dana Boyd's work at Data and Society has been looking into data voids. And data voids are a good way to describe those external nodes. It's words like Pizzagate, right? Like Pizzagate existed on the internet long before any of us knew it. And it was this conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton was involved in a pornography ring and blah, blah, blah. It was all, of course, false, but on the internet it seemed true because there was a bunch of sites talking about it and there was a bunch of YouTube talking about it. And the second that Pizzagate was covered by the mainstream media, everybody, of course, goes to their search engine and says, what is Pizzagate? And guess what? There's a whole bunch of links there telling you what Pizzagate is, but none of them are from credible sources. And so the problem that we have with something like TrustRank is unless we're going to remove parts of the internet, there's always going to be a problem of somebody creating a node and getting people to go there in one way, shape, or form. And as if we didn't have enough problems, we also have WhatsApp problems. So I don't know if anybody here uses WhatsApp. A lot of my friends do, so I'm on it as well. And WhatsApp is like, yeah, we're secure, we use end-to-end encryption. That's all great and fine. I think we should all use end-to-end encryption. That's a different talk, though. The fact of the matter is that people say that WhatsApp is a huge, huge spreader of fake news. And I was recently presenting in Brazil, and this indeed very deeply affected the Brazilian elections that elected what people call as the Brazilian Trump. And so WhatsApp is a real danger, and it's actually even more dangerous in India, where it's being used to spark mob violence. And so there's quite a lot of deaths that is related to incendiary content quickly spreading on WhatsApp. But WhatsApp says we can't do anything because it's encrypted. So we're not going to break encryption. Good job, don't do that. So what are we going to do? Well, it's a kind of open secret that even though WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted, they are not encrypting the metadata. So they know who you're talking to and how often and who's in what group chats and so forth. And they also don't encrypt your files. So every time you upload a file to WhatsApp, it checks the cryptographic hash and it says, yes, is it on the server or is it not on the server? And if it's not on the server, it just points to the file itself. So we're all sharing files on WhatsApp. Every time we're forwarding, WhatsApp knows that we're linking to the same file, and they do it because of CDNs and other reasons that they have for doing this, and doing so in a fast way. However, some researchers in India who are concerned about a rising death toll say, well, if you had a reporting feature where I could say that this file was incendiary content, perhaps you could slow or stop the fake news problem or this type of propaganda that is spreading violence. Yes? But what are the repercussions from a privacy perspective? And what are the repercussions from a state-level censorship? Or what are the repercussions of a bot army reporting something that is actually true as false, right? And I think this may be a short-term fix, but a longer-term fix in terms of what does it mean for us to have monitoring of whatever images we're sharing. That might be a lose-lose situation in the long run. And this has been fairly present within the machine learning community as it's become known that for a variety of chat messengers in China, they're doing real-time OCR and detection and banning of images. So when you're sharing something in Chinese and the images can be read and it says something bad about the party or the government and so forth, then these are immediately added to a banned list, and permutations of those images, which are being generated by machine learning, are also being put on banned lists and affecting people's social scores and so forth. So when we implement something like this, we have to think about what are the long-term repercussions as a society. So, unfortunately, fake news and misinformation is a hard problem. Let's see if abuse and hate is perhaps easier. Maybe it is. Thank you, Google. Google says they fixed it. Google solved hate speech. We can all go home. Thank you, Google. Very awesome. Google released Perspective AI earlier this year, and the woman in charge of Perspective AI said, guess what? We can tell the difference between saying I'm a proud gay man and you're gay when it's meant as insulting. And I thought, wow, that's really awesome, because it's actually a really hard problem in natural language processing. We'll get more on that, why that's a hard problem later. And so I went online, and I identify as a queer woman, and so I said, okay, let me try that word, because that word is also often used as an insult. And as a queer woman was totally fine, as a queer white woman, slightly less fine, and then as a queer black woman, no. And yeah, it jumps from 0.29 to as a queer woman to 0.47, which is unsure. So we get the circle means yes, it's fine. The square means unsure. And I think there's another triangle or something for definitely not. So why does this happen? Why is this still happening even though they say they fixed this problem? Why is it still happening? Well, let's talk about how we train language models. How language modeling works. How many people here work actually in natural language processing? Anyone? Okay, great. This is news to everyone then. How language modeling works is generally we use now unsupervised techniques. And unsupervised techniques means that we collect as much data as possible and we feed it, and then we're like, look, it totally works. It's fine. It looks like natural language. It's totally fine. And one of the popular data sets for this is Reddit, because Reddit has so many comments and it's gigs and gigs, and you can download it and you can train on it and it's totally fine. But the problem is that Reddit has a little bit of a diversity problem. A survey of US-based Reddit news users is around 70% male, about 60% under 30, so forget about asking questions for anybody who has problems over 30, and 74% white. For comparison, the US demographic is below a stark difference. And so when we use Reddit to model the world, we are modeling a world of a very small set of users. And when we use language on Reddit, we end up creating some problems. Now, I did some research on bias in word embeddings or word vectors. This is some of how I got interested in bias in machine learning problems. And this was part of the Google released news vectors. So this is publicly released data from Google. And what they said is, we trained this, we did this only on news sources, it'll be totally fine. And they released it, and a bunch of people that I know and a bunch of companies that I know started immediately using these word vectors. The reason why we have word vectors, or as they're sometimes called word embeddings, is we need a mathematical representation of language in order to use it, especially in a field like deep learning. So as deep learning has taken off, so have concepts like word embeddings. So, what can we find, however, in word embeddings? We think of this as a spatial representation of language. And when I say the most similar to immigrant, we get immigrants, that's fine. We get immigrant, that's fine. We get migrant, slightly less fine. And then boom, we get to illegal immigrant. And this is actually, I have a whole blog post on this and a notebook that you can go through and so forth, but this is actually some of the tame stuff that I found. This is the more tame vectors I found. There's actually a lot worse in there. And this is supposedly, again, only trained on news. Which leads me to the diversity crisis within AI. There was a research paper released by OpenAI earlier this year. That's a large group that's working on different AI models and so forth. And they found that indeed there is a significant diversity crisis within AI. Only 18% of authors at AI conferences are women. More than 80% of AI professors are men. And for example, let's take a look at industry. 2.5% of Google's workforce is black. And this is Google that does a whole bunch of programs to try and reach out to traditionally African American universities and other types of diversity efforts. And this is still how bad it is. And until we fix this diversity crisis, as the report says, and as I strongly believe and second, we are gonna still have racist word embeddings and other issues in our word embeddings because we don't have the right people thinking about the right parts of the problem. We need to have a diverse group of people thinking about these problems. So, we didn't fix hate or abuse, we didn't fix misinformation yet, but let's actually dive into ways that AI or machine learning is helping spread misinformation, propaganda, and fake news at faster levels than ever before. Deepfakes. Everybody here has heard of deepfakes? How many people saw the original deepfakes? It's okay, I won't judge you. The original deepfakes were pornographic in nature. The original deepfakes were all for celebrities doing porn. It was like Jennifer Aniston does whatever, right? And so the advent of deepfakes in 2017 was completely sponsored, let's say, by Reddit and porn. Fast forward to now. Now we have a little bit more interesting deepfakes happening, not just pornographic, but ones where Jordan Peele, who's a famous comedian, actor, and director, he's on the right, can get President or former President Barack Obama to say different things. Now, how does deepfakes work? Deepfakes work in a lot of different ways, but how this one works, for example, is it uses facial landmarks. And so this is actually a real video of Obama. All that they did was they changed the way that his mouth was moving, and then they changed the audio, right? And so to change the way his mouth is moving, they use a special type of encoding that takes the landmarks from Jordan Peele's face and puts them on Obama's face and encodes it so Obama's lips are shaped like that. And then from that point in time, it uses something called a GAN, which is a generative adversarial network. How GANs work is they have something called a discriminator that determines whether something is real or fake. And so a GAN's entire nature is to try to make the most realistic thing as possible. You've probably seen GAN-created art and all of these other types of things. But this just means that deep fakes have fooled a neural network into believing that they're real, and unfortunately we're getting stronger and stronger neural networks via computation and different architecture choices. And so for this reason, the deep fakes are getting better and better. They're even difficult for experts to begin to tell apart. Moving into the language space, we have GPT-2. Who here has heard of GPT-2? Maybe you saw like a headline about it or something. This is this natural language text generation that again was an OpenAI project, and they said it's too dangerous to release. This is problematic because we need to have open science, we need to review things, and a lot of people thought that this was a bad choice for them to not release GPT-2. There was a lot of flack and critique that they got from the natural language community, and many people think that they used a lot of different things that were already released. For example, BERT. Now there's Ernie, and there's a whole Grover, and there's a whole bunch of other ones that are happening around new ways of language modeling. But again, this is all happening in an unsupervised context. So what could go wrong? Well, earlier this year, there was a whistleblower at Facebook who alerted the US State Department that they were creating terrorist pages on Facebook. And this is not somebody at Facebook like, yeah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. This was automatic. And this was automatic because Facebook said, we don't have enough pages, we need more content. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go on people's pages, we're gonna see what they're writing about, we're gonna do some entity extraction, and if something is not there, we're gonna create a new page for it. And so, of course, you know, the algorithm's like, yeah, I found an entity, I found Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, quick, make a page. And this ended up creating a bunch of pages and a bunch of video content and a bunch of other stuff that was related to terrorism. And then they're like, oops, forgot about that part of the internet. And they quickly fixed it, because of course they have the US government breathing down their neck, and Zuckerberg, as I'm sure that you've seen, doesn't like sweating in front of Congress very long. So they fixed it, but they didn't fix automatic content creation. What they fixed is their ability to determine if it's terrorist or not. So part of their content moderation now is a very strong definition of anything that could be terrorist related. So what GPT-2 means is we can create text pretty easily, supposedly, from just a small header. And so we can create this realistic text that, again, is probably just repeating a lot of things it said. So remember Reddit, what could happen? And we just are speeding up the ability to generate a whole bunch of content as quick as possible. And so what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, Facebook was like, I know how to solve this problem. Machine learning. Machine learning is going to solve all of humanity's problems. Just let Facebook do it. It'll be totally fine. And so they announced a Kaggle challenge on deepfakes, and they said, guess what? We're going to solve the machine learning thing with more machine learning, because that totally makes sense, right? And so they're deep on this path that Kaggle is going to solve the whole problem for us. I'm slightly more skeptical, as I hope is evident. There's also the pondering of regulation, right? So the US government has had a bunch of hearings on this type of thing. I was just reading earlier today some of the EU reports on this type of thing. Perhaps we can see some of the fines that Facebook is already going to get on advertising political news within Germany and not marking it as an advertisement. So Germany has already filed suit against Facebook for this, and hopefully other countries will follow in maybe pushing some regulation on the spread of this type of content. However, when I was doing the research for this, I came across some good Polish propaganda, and or fake news or misinformation, whatever you want to call it. And I found myself in like a corner of Twitter where I couldn't read anything, but thankfully there's the tweet übersetzen. And for this reason, I was able to find this image, right? And of course, the natural language processing is not perfect. However, it was very clear to me that this was saying something bad about elections in Germany because there's a bunch of Afro-Deutsch people who are running for parliament. And I thought to myself, damn, that's a lot of Afro-Deutsch people. I want to move there. Where's that place? And so I started doing a little research, and I started looking it up because I have never in my life in Germany seen that many posters of faces of color, and I was pretty excited and enthused about the idea. However, I came quickly to the realization that these are from different elections, they are from different states, and therefore this image itself is indeed doctored. Now, all the politicians are real, and the posters, I'm sure, existed. However, them all on a poll together, extremely unlikely unless somebody actually did it themselves, right, by gathering the posters and putting them together for this photo. More likely, it was doctored in some way. And after a quick reverse image search, I saw that this only populated via other I presume to be message boards, meme boards, and so forth in Poland. And so it was only distributed really across the internet in Polish. And that took me about 5 minutes. It took me about 5 minutes, and with my knowledge of how these things work. So for a human, it's actually not that hard, as long as you know what to look for, to try and figure out if something is real or fake. Interesting problem. So what happens when our tools betray us? That's really where we are today, right? We've created social networking, we've created lots of messaging, we've created ways to deliver content fast to one another, and now we have unfortunately created a nightmare. However, this is not necessarily a new nightmare. This is just repeating of an old nightmare, which is why I wanted to start back in the early 1900s and talk about all of this types of special advertising. Now, Cambridge Analytica. Let's talk about how that happened. Michał Kosinski, he was one of the main researchers at Cambridge who was actually working with what's called the psychoanalytics branch, and they were determining, could you figure out sensitive identity or demographic traits of a person just based on their public Facebook likes. This was a paper that they released in 2013, which was the beginning of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a different professor, not him. And they found that you could tell gender very quickly, you could often tell sexual identity, you could often tell race, you could even oddly tell whether a person's parents were divorced or not. Don't ask me what likes say that, but yes, you could tell a lot of different things, including alcohol and drug use and other types of things like this, just looking at public Facebook likes. Okay, and when they released this, they said, had a long ethics section that said, this is potentially dangerous, we're not sure, if this can be used for a bad thing, but we're gonna publish it anyways because we found it, and so here you are. And Kosinski actually went with the head of the psychoanalytics at Cambridge when they found out a colleague was working with somebody to do with elections and tried to report it, but unfortunately, Cambridge didn't publicly announce that until much later. And when we look at this room and we look at technologists that are working on different problems within our field, one of the things that we often go to is optimization, right? We always want to optimize things, and often we want to optimize for engagement because engagement sounds really fun and cool. I want to be engaged online too. But the problem with engagement is we don't actually ask users, like, do you feel engaged right now? We use what we call engagement metrics. And engagement metrics are time on site, amount of content viewed, amount of content posted or shared, likes, all of these types of things. And when we optimize for things like engagement or time on site, what we end up creating is, unfortunately, addiction and other types of issues where people are consuming more and more content than they want. The creator of the infinite scroll has, this is from a video with him, has likened the infinite scroll to a study that was done by dietitians where they took somebody eating a bowl of soup and they slowly filled more soup in the bottom as they were eating. And what they found is people would eat like double or triple the amount of soup if you just fed them more soup while they were eating the soup already. They would just eat a whole bunch of it. And they were like, yeah, this is probably a bad idea, but if you want to sell soup, this is a great way to sell soup. And so what he said is the infinite scroll, which seemed like a great idea, people just want more content. They don't want to have to click next. It led to what he calls obesity of the mind. It led to obesity of the mind because we don't know when to stop. We don't know when to put down our phone. We don't know when to disengage. And as many different research that has been showing on the YouTube recommendation algorithm, eventually, if you keep clicking and if you keep clipping, you get to conspiracy theories. And in my research, Poland is not immune to conspiracy theories. No, yes, I learned this on the internet. Here is a piece of art from Roman Stenchuk. Okay, yeah, sorry. And it's called Flight. And it's on display right now in Venice, and it shows an inside-out airplane. And I've read a lot about Polish history since I moved to Germany especially, and been thinking about the relationship between the place I live and the place where my grandparents came from, and it's not a great history, right? Poland has been under constant attack for decades, if not centuries, and this creates a psychological problem for society, right? And this flight is, of course, a reference to Smolensk, and it's a reference to a society turned inside out, and it's a reference to politics turned inside out, and identity turned inside out, and other problems that happen. And part of the way that these problems happen is when conspiracy theories or mistrust, they go mainstream. And if conspiracy is mainstream and mistrust is mainstream, then it is exceptionally difficult to have a functioning, open democracy. And so how can we fight this? How can we move forward? I have a few ideas, and I have some concerns and some things that I think if you have energy and optimism, I would like your help in fighting some of this. First and foremost is media and AI literacy. It's really important that the average person can understand the media and the content that they're engaging with, and that the average person can understand how AI or natural language processing or machine learning or whatever we're calling it today, how it works and how to engage with it. There was a really interesting article released last week of some research on teaching kids about AI. They're surrounded by machine learning, they should learn how AI works and so forth. They did an experiment where they said, make software, essentially, or they called it an algorithm, but I believe it was more like software design, to make the best sandwich. And so they were designing it, and one of the kids pulls aside one of the teachers and says, is this supposed to be fact or opinion? And so they're already thinking and asking these critical questions. And I don't think it's only young people that can learn to ask these questions. I believe it's everybody that can learn to ask these questions. And so when we see an image, like what we did as an exercise earlier today, we can look at it and we can critically distance ourselves and say, what is this image making me feel? What is this image trying to make me think? What is the author or the creator of this image trying to say? Because even when it's a real image, even when it's photojournalism, it's usually done in a way that it's trying to evoke something from us. And so we need media literacy and we need AI literacy to be widespread, and not only for kids in schools, but for big kids, adults. Additionally, we need better ways to safely report and safely block online. From a hate and abuse perspective, I have friends that have been targeted, harassed, death threats, taken offline, doxxed, and so forth for having certain political beliefs, right? And so safe reporting is going to be pretty critical. And as I was reading through a lot of the literature on both fighting abuse and harassment as well as fighting misinformation, there was a lot of really good ideas in terms of labeling. So how can we label the content, and how can we determine and therefore use it for more machine learning and for better machine learning? And so what I have here on the right is something called Text Thresher, which was a project by some folks, I believe at Berkeley and Stanford. Haha. Anyways, and this was a different way of determining different labels and agreement amongst many labelers. And I say if we are reporting things like it's disrespectful or offensive, we could also ask people to highlight the parts of it that are disrespectful or offensive. And we could perhaps use this to better automatically detect these things over time. Because what we need for some of this is really better labels and a better understanding that we humans are pretty good at, and hopefully we can find a better representation of this. In addition, safe blocking, the ability to block content beyond a single person, is perhaps more important for fighting abuse online than automated detection of it. And so, what have we created, right? Arvind Narayanan, who's a researcher at Princeton, and he has a pretty awesome research group there, they've been working on what he calls dark patterns in advertising. And what are advertising dark patterns? Well, they're kind of similar to what we've been talking about the entire time that I've been up here. It's the idea that we can influence a person to do something, to buy faster, to buy more, and so on and so forth, by giving them certain messaging, right? And so this one up here, Jacqueline from Jacksonville just saved blah, blah, blah on her order. This is actually generated by JavaScript. If you refresh the page, a different person saved a different amount. You can actually even look in the page source, it's right there. Yeah, maybe not so great. And again, is making people feel like, oh, look, there's all these people on this site buying stuff. I should buy stuff too. We have things like on the right, yes, I'd like to get the discount. No thanks, I hate money. Right? Or other messaging like this, I hate myself, so I'm gonna click no. And this type of messaging, you know what I mean, is pretty bad, right? But it's pretty common. I mean, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. Probably some of us have occasionally done a dark pattern or two because we were instructed or we were asked or it was just a story that we had to deal with and whatever. What we have here too is Kim Kardashian, who has come under fire many, many times, but recently Flat Tummy Tea, who she was doing a lot of influencer posts for, has came out and they've been targeting a psychological profile of overweight and insecure women on Instagram, and they've been targeting their entire ads towards women that they deem or that they've profiled as overweight and insecure. And so these type of dark patterns are already here. Sometimes we've helped create them. And when we create people that are incentivized, that are psychologically targeted all day online, then it's no wonder that they continue to be psychologically targeted in a political way. So we already primed them. You already, as a user on the internet, feel like everybody's always trying to tell you and convince you of something, and you gotta do it faster, and you gotta try harder, and you gotta click the big button. And every time that we prime people like this, we prime it for things like President Trump to happen. And we prime it for things like misinformation and propaganda online to happen. And when I look at this image, it infuriates me because it's the idea that we are kind of just co-signing to all of this happening. That as tech workers and as tech leaders, we're kind of just going along with it. That we're like, yeah, we know there's a Reddit problem and whatever, but like it kind of works sometimes, so let's just keep going with it. Let's not stop and question, maybe is what we're doing ethical? Is what we're doing right? Is what we're doing just? Is what we're doing going to ruin democracy forever? We're not asking these questions, right? And I think there's a lot of smart people in this room, and I think there's smart people in this field, and what I hope we can do is we can use our intelligence to start questioning some of the methods and some of the priming and some of the advertising and the propaganda that we are a part of online. And we can instead, hopefully, figure out new ways that we can not only disengage from some of that misinformation, propaganda, and or marketing, safe propaganda, and we can find better ways to actually discontinue misinformation online. Because we're already at war. It's very clear from an information and an attention point. We are essentially at war. And what I'm not going to do is, I'm not going to, like the gentleman on this screen, I'm not going to take it sitting down. And I hope that you will stand up with me, and I hope that we can fight this together. Thank you very much.